Hello and welcome, PTF and JK back with our runner-by-runner guide for this year's Preakness Stakes. JK, you excited about this one coming up, this run for the Black-Eyed Susans in Baltimore?
It's always exciting, right? Because in most situations, I guess occasionally it's not the case, but in most situations, there's still the idea, the possibility of greatness. There's still a chance for a Triple Crown. Mystik Dan getting into the starting gate will be as exciting as you need it to be to see what happens. Selfishly, I think maybe I'm rooting for Mystik Dan because I think it'd be a lot of fun to have a Triple Crown at Saratoga on Fox. I think that'd be a lot of fun for racing in general. But we'll see. It's always a lot of fun, though. The Black-Eyed Susans, they do a great job at the Black-Eyed Susans at the Preakness, and so it should be a lot of fun.
Let's get into this, JK. We'll get to the specifics on Mystik Dan and every single horse in the race. Let's start with Mugatu. I'm going to keep it simple on this one. Unless you're a really big Zoolander fan, I don't see this one on many tickets.
No, it just has to get faster. I mean, there's not a way in which I can come up with a creative story, right? I mean, he closed a little bit at 181 to 1 in the Bluegrass and was beaten 7 lengths. I mean, I guess he ran better than he was supposed to run, but is he still anyone that you see getting the weather vane painted in their silks? I wouldn't knock them running in this race. You deserve it with the opportunity of the Bluegrass and some of the other races, but it doesn't make any sense to me.
No, looking very dangerous in a first-level allowance in a few weeks. I'll say that much for the horse, but outgunned and outmanned. Let's get to number 2. Uncle Heavy started the career at Parks, not a place always associated with Triple Crown starters, though it is where Smarty Jones came from. It's a nice-looking horse, has shown some guts in the races, but I just don't know that this horse is going to be good enough to make an impact against this field, especially because I feel like probably ultimately going to be a best going a mile or shorter. Am I underrating Uncle Heavy?
The Preakness is always one of those races where you're going to have the big-name horses from the Derby, and the horses that haven't run in the Derby are going to be ignored completely. You can think, I think when Big Brown won, right? He was 1-5 or whatever it was, but a bunch of prices came behind him. I feel like a horse Ichabod Crane hit that trifecta behind him at a big number. Uncle Heavy feels like that type of horse. While the rest of them are trying to win, Uncle Heavy and Irad Ortiz might take back, make one run, hope for a meltdown, and pick up 3rd or 4th. Outside of that, I can't think of anything creative with Uncle Heavy.
Still sounds like one you might use on some tickets in the deep verticals. Very interesting. Let's move on to number 3, Catching Freedom. Speaking of deep verticals, this is a horse that I think has a very good chance to run 3rd or 4th, but I'm splitting hairs here in that I really don't love him, especially at the likely price he's going to be as a fancy Derby runner who certainly ran okay in that race. Coming back in 2 weeks in the Preakness, he's a big name, but I think he was probably flattered by the pace shape in the Derby. Not sure he will be here. Like him for 3rd and 4th, probably going to leave him out of 1st and 2nd. Where do you stand with Catching Freedom?
Yeah, it's funny. This race is really, to me, it's so much less about the individuals and who I think is the most likely winner. Because I don't have the strongest opinion on who's the most likely winner. But I do know there's going to be a handful of horses that are just completely bet out of whack. Catching Freedom is one of them. Catching Freedom, who ran well in the Derby, right? If you run 4th, beating a length and a half in the Derby, that you ran well. However, if we believe this to be true, which is that the Derby's pace was fast and the race fell apart, you cannot get overly excited about Catching Freedom, who seemed to be picking up pieces. Now, he maybe was a little bit closer to the pace than it might have looked, but still, no matter how you shape it, he was a closer, closing into a fast pace, and one that likely will be the 3rd choice. It will be a cheeky alternative for a lot of people, and I cannot get behind Catching Freedom in this spot. I think he'll be extremely overbet, and likely, I don't think he'll be the most overbet horse in the race because that's just not the way that works in the Preakness, but I think he's going to be overbet for sure.
That's an interesting question, one that we could parse, and we'll parse farther when we do our other shows this week. We've got a live stream. The live stream will have happened by the time this video drops, but you can go back and look at the archive for our Pick 5 get through for this Saturday card at Pimlico. We're also going to have a pro player show with Duke Matisse That's the kind of show where we're going to do video this time. And that's the kind of show where we get into these questions of like defining overbet and what it means relative to the field, etc. Make sure you catch those things on YouTube while I'm doing a little bit of housekeeping, giving out some interesting stuff. And before we get to the heavy hitters in the 4 and 5 gates for this year's Preakness, let me also encourage folks to check out the first Grand 3 Pick'em. This is a free contest with a chance to win $5 million. All you have to do, it ain't easy, is pick the superfecta in 3 races, starting with the Preakness on this Saturday. Give you an opportunity to go to inthemoneypodcast.com/grand to get more information and to make your picks. And you got that chance to win $5 million if you get these 3 races right. But somebody's going to walk away with $100,000, that is, and it's a free roll. So make sure you check out the first Grand Pick'em. 4-gate, Muth. This horse will be your favorite coming out of that Arkansas Derby win where he dispatched the Derby winner rather handily. He's been training up to this, and this horse, I think, is a deserving favorite. The question is, what price should he be? Really interesting here, JK. The morning line of 8 to 5, that sounds pretty reasonable to me. In England, up until yesterday, he was odds on. He went odds against this morning. Maybe those prices are going to converge. I don't know. I really like this horse, but do I like him at even money? Not really. I really start to like him if he gets closer to that USA morning line. We're not going to know till the off, obviously. To me, he's the most likely winner, but I'm not sure this is the horse I want to pick in this video with the uncertainty about where this price is going to land. Give me your overall thoughts on Muth.
Well, the problem with Muth is that he's going to be bet like he ran a 106 Beyer speed figure in the Arkansas Derby, but he didn't. He ran slower than that. And that's the problem I have, is that while he is the fastest horse and he is from a Hall of Fame trainer that wins this race, and he is a fresh horse, and he is coming here pointing to this spot, and he does have all this speed, and he did beat Mystik Dan, all of those things are all great. But to me, they just don't line up with what the price he's going to be by the chance that I actually think he's going to win. He's not a horse that I'm going to try to beat in multi-race wagers if I have other strong opinions throughout those cards, throughout the card, that pick 5 or pick 6 or whatever I may be playing. But he's a horse that probably is going to win. But man, at the price he's going to be, he just does not get me going. I'm going to have to take a wagering stand against him. Not a stand against him from a win standpoint, but for a stand against him from a wagering standpoint. I just think he's going to be overbet. Talented as he is, he just isn't that 10-point Beyer edge that he's going to be bet like he has.
98 was the Beyer speed figure in the Arkansas Derby. That's slower than the 100 that Mystik Dan was awarded. Folks are going to say, okay, he beat Mystik Dan. Well, when we get to Mystik Dan, we'll talk about the circumstances as far as that one went. Let me just drill down one thing on Muth. You say he's going to be overbet relative to his chance. What's his chance? I mean, do you think I think he's not quite as short as 50-50 to me, but, he's getting there. Like, how many times out of 100 does he win this race?
I would say he probably wins at half the time. Okay. I just
could be odds against, though, which would make it not a bad bet then.
Yeah, JK tries, math fails. He's not an even money shot to me into the teeth of a Derby winner who I believe ran a pretty damn good race.
Let's get on to that Derby winner, and there's so much to discuss about him. I want to start by going back and talking about the Arkansas Derby. Yes, seemingly Muth handled him easily, but I think when you look at those 2 trips, it's fair to say Mystik Dan, with the trouble he had, being a bit against the flow, I'm not going to say he was best or anything like that, but I'm going to say, I think it's fair to say that he was closer to Muth than that margin of victory suggests. Then there's the Derby. You and I both said that he was not the best horse in the Derby all in all. But at the same time, I think there's people out there who are underrating his Derby performance a little bit in terms of pace dynamics. This was a pace that collapsed. He was close up to it. In the Money Media's own Justin Christine made the case that he still thought it was a pretty perfect trip, given that a lot of the speed that faded had reasons to fade other than the pace that day, and he did certainly get that dream run through on the rail. Look, you put it all in the hopper. I'm going to say his Derby was probably a little bit better than that Beyer speed figure suggests. given the fact that he was so close to that fast pace. I still can't shake the idea that last time 18-1, this time 5-2. Last time was probably the time you wanted to have him, but this is a horse that still makes a lot of sense. He has to be considered one of the key contenders in this race, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's going to be shorter than 5-2. He's a Derby winner. And here's the problem: is if this race was taking place any other time of the year, right? You just change the names. Call it the Holy Bull to the Florida Derby. Call it the Whitney to the Woodward. Call it the Haskell to the Travers. Call it whatever you want to call it. Mystik Dan would not be as overbet, but because he's the Derby winner, from a win standpoint, he is going to take win money that I don't think he quite deserves. Although I do think he is a likely winner of this race. And if I knew that he wasn't going to catch unfair Derby money, he's who I would pick, because he is, and he was close to that pace that fell apart. And I think he deserves an upgrade for that. But the problem is that he's going to be overbet as the Derby winner into the teeth of a talented horse like Muth. So it's like I'm so torn between these two horses, because I think that they both are legitimate contenders, but their prices are just going to be out of whack because of the narratives that surround them. One of them a very easily digestible one, Derby winner, and the other one, all the things I pointed out about Muth. I have to play against these two horses from a win standpoint, but man, it feels pretty dirty trying to do so, because I think they're both pretty darn good and they both make some sense. I just don't think they're as good as their price is going to be.
I'll tell you what, as folks who work in horse racing and are big horse racing fans, you almost have a built-in emotional hedge. If Mystik Dan wins, it's going to be a real fun 3 weeks to Belmont. Maybe I don't need to cash a bet on him in this race. I'll be happy anyway if he can get the job done, and he's certainly not out of it, but I tend to agree. Probably not where the value lies. Number 6, Seize the Gray, is interesting. He reminds me of Mystik Dan in that this is a horse that had kind of a perfect trip, but from a strictly dynamics point of view, when you look how close he was in the Pat Day Mile, you could upgrade him several points. In fact, Timeform US gave him a really big upgrade for how close he was to that pace in the Pat Day Mile, a bigger upgrade than they gave Mystik Dan for same. The reality is the race didn't come back that fast, and he's another one I sort of can't shake the idea that last time was the time. But in the UK prices right now at 20-1, would I blame anybody who wanted to take a shot that this horse could keep improving? No, I would not argue with them, but he's not exactly for me. Do you see much with Seize the Gray?
No, I get it. To be fair, from a speed standpoint, he's not that far off. And we've talked about how I think horses run well. I know that we have this narrative about people not wanting to run back in the Preakness in 2 weeks. I don't think it's because they don't. I don't think it's because they don't think they run well off of 2 weeks of rest. I think that they feel like, why do that when I can wait 5 weeks for this, or 6 weeks for that, or 8 weeks for this? I think the racing calendar is why people probably skip the Preakness. I don't think it has anything to do with the 2 weeks. And so I think Seize the Gray could run well off of that. He was in good form, and I think horses off 2 weeks will stay in good form. And I think that he'll run well enough. I just think he's too slow to beat some of these top horses. But definitely a horse, if you're playing that Grand 3 thing, one that you might want to consider using in your superfectas to try to, especially, I'm assuming that there's some value to getting some unique superfectas too, as people kind of get whittled away. Having Seize the Gray in second or third or something like that, I think is definitely interesting.
Speaking of horses coming back in 2 weeks, speaking of horses trained by D. Wayne Lucas, let's talk about Just Steel. Just Steel reminds me a little tiny bit of an old school Preakness winner, a horse called Oxbow. He was contesting the pace at a fast-paced Derby and ended up far back in the field, and then came back in 2 weeks and was able to do a lot better on the lead. Here's the problem, though. Oxbow was able to get an uncontested lead back in that, whatever it was, 2013 Derby. Just Steel's going to have company on the lead, and ultimately, that's why I have to side against him. But it's not like I'd fall out of my chair or anything if the pace isn't what's expected here and he were to do well. I think the worst news for Just Steel is you've got 2 Bob Baffert runners, one of whom is surely going to be sent for the front, I would think, or at least sitting right off this one's hind. Ultimately, I sided against Just Steel, but I thought it was worth making that pace point about him. What do you think about this one and his chances?
Yeah, look, I think you probably want him from a betting standpoint more than Catching Freedom. Not that you think that I think that he's going to win more races than Catching Freedom, but his price, I think, would kind of pay for that differentiation. He reminds me a little bit of Palace Malice too, right? A horse that got hooked up in a fast pace and completely fell apart. Palace Malice was 12th in that Derby, came back and won the Belmont, not the Preakness. But I think that a horse involved in the pace has an opportunity to run better. I just don't think he's fast enough, and I think that he ran so poorly, and he's going to have to really deal with some other pace horses, like you said. I don't need Just Steel, but I think that I would probably prefer him to Catching Freedom.
Let's talk about Tusk and Gold, the 8 runner. This is a horse that ran pretty well, I think, all things considered, in that Louisiana Derby. Best of speeds, got run down by 2 closers in the form of Catching Freedom and Honor Marie, both of whom actually ran okay, I think, on balance in the Derby, enough to make me think that Louisiana Derby is decent form. Chad Brown has a terrific record skipping the Derby and coming back in the Preakness. He's won with that move a couple of times, and with cloud computing and early voting. And then last year, Blazing Sevens ran a huge race under similar circumstances. He clearly has a sort of a wise guy idea with coming and targeting this race rather than the Derby with some of his horses that are maybe, a cut below the best horses in his barn. The bad news, such as it is for Tusk and Gold, is I think this is probably a better Preakness than many people expected. Still, this is a horse I think is worth discussing a little bit.
Yeah, look, this is going to be. We didn't talk about this production meeting in the show. I'm kind of picking 2 horses to win. It's this one, and there's only one left after that, so you can figure out the rest. I just feel like this horse has upside, has an opportunity to take another step forward, having all this time in between his races, not having the wears and tears of what the Kentucky Derby is, and not having the resume that Muth has. Muth's been running since he was a 2-year-old and has. So I just think that what we could expect from Tusk and Gold could be significantly better than what we've seen from him. I feel like the rest of the horses, we kind of know who they are. Yeah, there's a little bit of improvement that can be had, but we kind of know who they are. I think Tusk and Gold could take another step forward, and I think will be a price that makes you feel warm and fuzzy about trying to beat 2 nice horses in Muth and Mystik Dan.
We've got one more horse to talk about, and then we'll do our sort of final conclusion for this show. But one other thing I want to tell you about, another free opportunity to win some money. ContestJockey.com is having an event on Saturday. It is absolutely free to play. You go to ContestJockey.com, create an account, enter the game. And the prize money, we got 2 things in the prize pool for this. One is bets on the last race on this Preakness card, which is pretty cool, I think. It's a thoroughbred race, the get out race. You can, if you finish in, I think it's going to be the top 3, you're going to have a chance to win a free bet. We'll get you hooked up, and we'll fire some money in for you on this last thoroughbred race. I think it's going to be a wild and fun betting pool in this. You can call it the get out race. You can call it the top up race, whatever you want to call it. But there's money on the line. And if you finish in the top 10% of the contest, you're going to get a free month of In the Money Plus, which is our service where you get extra podcasts, digestive tips from all the shows, etc. Extra written content. I mentioned Justin Christine before. We're just dropping on In the Money Plus today his full trip notes for both the Oaks and Derby. Lots of great additional content via In the Money Plus. Go to contestjockey.com and sign up for that free event today. The 9th and final runner in this year's Preakness is number 9, Imagination. This horse was a heavy favorite in the Santa Anita Derby. He was game and fought all the way to the line, but he could not beat Stronghold. Stronghold came back to run in the Derby. I don't think he ran terribly, really. He was in the hunt at the pace call and really kind of ran to me like a horse who just didn't want to go that far, but I'm not willing to condemn the form of the Santa Anita Derby based on that. On pace figures, you'd think this horse might be able to be out there setting the early fractions. Frankie Dettori in the irons here, an aggressive rider. He's an interesting one. I know you like him, so I'll let you make the proper case.
Yeah, it's not really it's more of an alternative to the 2 horses that I think are going to be overbet, right? And if Tusk and Gold isn't fire, I'd like to have a little Imagination as well. Imagination just looks a lot like National Treasure, right? National Treasure was 4th in the Santa Anita Derby, had to skip Santa Anita Derby, had to skip the Kentucky Derby, shows up and wins the Preakness. I feel very similar about Imagination, who was 2nd in the Santa Anita Derby, had to skip the Kentucky Derby, now shows up in the Preakness. And the other main speed horse, I think, is Muth. They're not going to ding-dong with each other. I don't think that any of these other horses have the early speed to keep up with whichever one of those is sent aggressively to the front. And I would project that when they turn for home, Imagination will be on the lead. And who knows? Maybe he loves the mile and 3/16. Maybe he loved the time in between races. Maybe he grew up and got faster. and at a nice price, he can maybe wire this field. So I think both of those horses offer a lot of value in terms of the win pool because the other two are just going to be overbet.
I'm not ruling out doing a lot with Muth depending on what the price is. Interestingly, Jonathan, I think, thinks he's a more likely winner than I do, but I'm not convinced that we're not going to get a 6-5, 7-5, 3-2 kind of price, which would allow me to get a little more around him. But I'm not picking him. For this video, for my official selection in the race, I'm going to go with Tusk and Gold. I think this horse is going to be higher than 6-1, and this is a horse that I think you can probably key things around in first, second, and third. We're going to get much more into a discussion of wagering strategy on our other videos. We encourage you to subscribe to the In the Money Media YouTube channel so you never miss an episode. Also, check us out on the podcast side wherever you get your shows. In the Money Players podcast, we'll have that Pro Player show, and we're going to have our Pick 5 show as well. JK, a closing thought before we get out of here.
Get your Preak on. It's one of my favorite lines ever. Get your Preak on.
There you go. We'll be back with much more content very soon.